Good morning. There's a story that came out of the 1999. There was an earthquake that hit Turkey and caused a fair bit of devastation. And there's a story that started to circulate from that incident of a father who went looking for his child in the rubble. And the way the story goes is that he kept looking despite, even long beyond kind of the hope that people thought were likely to find survivors. He went into areas where rescue crew told him it was too dangerous to go, but in his desperation, he just kept on searching. He kept on searching after people told him that he needed to start to come to terms with what has happened. And amazingly, in his search, he eventually heard the voice of his son call back to him, and they found his son and some other kids that were trapped in a air pocket that had been formed from some collapsed buildings. And amazingly, he found this child. It's a great story of kind of this relentless love of this father just pressing, keep on looking. One of the things he said is the whole time when he was fighting off giving up hope, he just kept telling himself, I promised him I would always be there for him. And so that drove him on to just kind of fulfill that promise in that moment. It's a great story of relentless love. It's a hard story for us to apply when we think about God in the Bible as a God of relentless love that keeps pursuing. It's hard to apply because on one level, God is relentless in that sense of the way he chases his people. And we read through the Bible, God continually coming to his people, chasing them, bringing them back to him. But on the other hand, he is the all-powerful God that's in control of everything. He's not a powerless, desperate father just hoping beyond hope, but actually he's a God that has a plan. And so we see, though, that level of a relentless God, but a relentless God who has a plan and is delivering that plan. And we see that through the Old Testament, right through. In fact, one of the things we feel sometimes when we read the Bible is the New Testament is this God who shows relentless love, and he comes near and he comes to his people. But the Old Testament is the God who is off in the distance, kind of taking pot shots at his people, just like smite them here, smite them there. Sometimes it feels a bit like that's kind of the Old Testament. But that isn't the real picture we get of the Old Testament, and it becomes really clear in this story we read today in Genesis 18. A God who does come near, a God who does have intimate, loving relationship with his people. And so we're going to look at that, this idea of a God who comes near, a God who has relentless love. And we see that quite explicitly in this story of these three visitors that come to Abraham. It's a really relatable story, I'm sure. You get this story. Abraham is sitting at the entrance of his tent. I mean, already relatable to us all, right? Living in your tent. I mean, you're on holidays. We're told it's the heat of the afternoon, and he's just settled in for his nana nap. I don't know why nanas get exclusive rights on nana naps, but he's settled in. It's the heat of the day. If you've ever spent any time in a tent on a hot day, you understand what happens there. He's settled into his nana nap outfit in his undies, lying in the tent, right? This is all relatable to you all, I'm sure. And then suddenly sees peering into his tent three strange men. A very awkward scene going on. We're told he rushes out to them. Maybe he wasn't in his undies, I've added that bit. He rushes out to them, and they clearly are, whoever he thinks, they're clearly some sort of important person with the way he bows down low. He's 99 at this stage, so maybe the bow started this and kind of just kept on going, and he's trying to process his options in getting back up from the bow. But the way he acts and responds to them, I mean, he's a nomadic man. Seeing people wandering, showing up at his tent is probably not that common. So he responds overwhelmingly. I mean, if you notice this, if you followed along in the story, this story escalates really quickly. If you want a story of an example of an important person comes to your house and you want to trick them into staying for 3 days, this is the key, right? here's what he says. He says, if it pleases you, just stop for a little while. I'll get some water, wash your feet. You can have some food, have a quick little break. That's what he says to them. They go, okay, sure. And this is what it says. Verse 6, Abraham ran to the tent, and he said to Sarah, get 3 large measures of the best flour and bake some bread. This is his plan for their small snack on an afternoon in the heat. He says 3 large measures. The best we can kind of guess that measurement is about 22 litres of flour. That's some serious bread going on right there. I don't know if they're baking it all that afternoon. So he says, stop for a little time. I'll get some food. In he's going, baking. They have opened a bakery at this point. And then he goes, we're told, he ran to the herd and chose a tender calf, and he prepares that. I mean, this really defines platter to plate here. It reminds me of that Simpsons episode, The Slaughterhouse, where Mr. Burns goes to the steakhouse called The Slaughterhouse, and he chooses his cow, and he says, that one, and they shoot it dead on the spot, and he goes, oh, it died a bit too quickly. How about that one? That's kind of the picture we get here. Like, this is some guys have showed up and said to get a snack, and Abraham is like preparing a feast. I mean, this just another reminder that the myth that the Bible was written by some Englishman, like this is not the English kind of thing to do, is it? Like, this is not Arnott's biscuits. Stay for a little while. I mean, could have been Tim Tams. He could have laid out the good biscuits. But this is serious feasting going on here. It's quite a unique story. It's quite a unique story in and of itself of the kind of unique feast that happens. But that's not the most unique thing about this story. The most unique thing about this story is the special visitor that's there. We're told there's 3 guys, but one of them in particular, we get this extra detail about them. One in particular is called the Lord. Now, I don't know if you know this, when you're reading in your Bible, sometimes the word Lord is capitalised, L-O-R-D. You see that, often it's small caps. When you see the Lord capitalised in your Bible, L-O-R-D, that is translated from the name of God, Yahweh. So they've translated that, but they've made it capital so you know it's his formal name. That's the word that's being translated there. So the first thing we get in this verse is verse 1, this chapter. The Lord appeared again to Abraham. I mean, again there is a clue. This has happened multiple times. Every time God offers the promises and blessings to Abraham, we're told the Lord appeared to him. So a lot of those stories, we don't know exactly what's happening there. We don't know if there's something visible that in appearing, or it's a voice or that. But we do know in this story, this time we're told the Lord appeared again to Abraham, but he doesn't seem to know who he is, because we see in verse 3, this is what we're told. He says, my Lord, right? In the translation, that's not capitalized. That word is translated, it's basically like a landlord, like a governor. He's saying, you're a respected one. So Abraham doesn't recognize him as Yahweh, but we're told Yahweh has appeared. He calls him Lord, small letters. Stop here for a while. As the story goes on, it becomes more and more clear. By verse 13, we're starting to see the Lord speaking to him. One of the characters in the tent, that dialogue that takes place, we start to get told it's the Lord. Or maybe you could understand it as there's another voice coming in, except we didn't read this bit. If you read on right up to verse 22, this is what verse 22 says. It says that the 2 of the 3 went on to Sodom, travelling on, but we're told the Lord, Yahweh, remained with Abraham. So this journey of revelation happens through this story. The Lord has appeared to Abraham. One of the 3 seems to be God himself, and that journey of discovery happens. As we read it, it happens for Abraham along that journey. This is an incredibly unique story in the Bible. There is actually none like it. There's times where God seems to show up in a human-like form in the Old Testament. We call them theophanies. That's what a theologian will call that, a theophany, when God shows up in a human-like form. Or sometimes we call them Christophanies, because there's a small suspicion here, though we can't be sure, but that God, the Trinity, the three-in-one, God the Father, God the Son, God the Holy Spirit, maybe the human-like form that shows up is actually the Christ. To be clear, not Jesus in the sense of he becomes a human later on, but Jesus in the sense of God the Son showing up in the Old Testament. So a theophany or a Christophany. It sounds a little bit like a musical kind of term there, like a symphony of theophanies. To be fair, often when the angels show up, it is, at the Christmas story, the angels light the sky singing the first Christmas carol. Probably wasn't Jingle Bells. That's kind of like a symphony, but this is just the language of God showing up, a theophany or a Christophany. That happens in the Bible. What's unique about this story is the table fellowship that happens. There is absolutely no other story in the Old Testament like it. Once with Moses, he eats in the presence of God, but this is eating with God. This is an incredibly powerful story of a God who comes near, a God who shows up. It's not the God that we sometimes think of the Old Testament off in the distance, firing pot shots. This is the God who has shown up for his people. Not only does he show up standing outside the tent, but he waits for Abraham to invite him in. This is the God who doesn't force his way in. He doesn't say, hey, I'm here. You should make a meal for me. You should let me sit down with you. This is the God who shows up and waits, gives Abraham the opportunity to invite him in. This is the same God we see in the New Testament. The God who we're told says that in Revelation, we're told that picture of Jesus standing at the door knocking in Revelation chapter 3. I stand here and knock, and anyone who opens the door. That's the picture we get here. Revelation 3 says, if anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in and eat with that person, and they with me. That's the picture we get here. That's the picture of the end of the Bible here in the beginning of the Bible. And it's a picture of who God is, a God who makes a way so that we can be in relationship with him. He shows up, but he waits for us to welcome him in. I heard someone talking about, like a atheist online, talking about the idea of how terrible it is that God would send anyone away from him. Why would he not welcome everyone? Why would there ever be such a place as hell? And a Christian responded to that video by using the analogy of adoption. He said, imagine you've got a really wealthy guy, and that wealthy guy says, I want to adopt you as my child. And someone says, no, I don't want to be adopted by you. I don't like you. I don't want to be with you. I don't want to be your child. And rejects that adoption. How ludicrous it would be if that person then, when the adopted parent died, said, where's my inheritance? He had all this money to share. Surely I should get some of that. After all, he did offer to adopt me. You would say, that's crazy. You rejected that adoption. And you would say, no way, that doesn't make sense. That's the same kind of picture we get here. That this is the God who shows up, but also invites us to welcome him in. That's the picture we get. He is the Lord who comes to us. He comes to us and he calls us to go to others. There's two pictures we get of that in this story. The first one is just from the Lord himself. The Lord himself gives us an example of what it looks like to reach out to people. He makes the journey, the impossible journey, a journey that Abraham couldn't make to get to God. God makes that journey to come to him. So God makes that journey, God shows up. But the second picture we get in this passage about what it looks like to be a people who go to others is actually the picture of welcoming we get from Abraham. Abraham gives us the example of what it looks like to be someone who is opening our lives up to others. The way Abraham responds to these people shows a generous sort of community welcoming that we are called to do. So much so that when the New Testament talks about being a welcoming people, it echoes this language. Listen to this. This is the writer of the book of Hebrews writing a letter to the Hebrew people in the New Testament. This is what he says about calling us to be a welcoming people. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 2. Don't forget to show hospitality to strangers, for some who have done this have entertained angels without realizing it. That's the language of the New Testament, echoing this one and only story we have in the Old Testament of this happening, and drawing those two together, saying this is the kind of welcoming we should do. This is the kind of welcoming we should be. We are a people that are called to go to open our lives to other people. I read Jean Calvin, the reformer theologian from the 1500s, in his commentary on Genesis on this story. He says, scarcely in the world does anyone offer this kind of welcoming today. Right? This is a guy in the 1500s saying when he looks around the world, he doesn't see this kind of welcoming. He goes on to say, the only time someone seems to offer this kind of welcoming is at an inn where there's an exchange of money. The only time someone is motivated to love someone with this kind of welcoming love, Jean Calvin is saying that it's when they're paid to do it. Isn't it interesting when we think about our world today that 500 years ago already a theologian was saying, I don't see this kind of welcoming? I think we would give a pretty serious reflection on the time span we live in and how much community has changed. And we would say this kind of welcoming to strangers is, I imagine, even less common than it was in Calvin's day. And yet we're called to be that kind of people. Now, to be fair, and I think we do need to process some of this, the world of community has changed today than it ever was before. Communication and travel has changed. And so there's a sense where our community is not necessarily less than previous generations, but it is definitely different. There's a sense where our relationship with our neighbour has diminished, but our reach on how far we can have a relationship has increased, right? So your capacity for relationship has gone global, essentially, in the world we live in today. And so you may not know your neighbour as well as other times in history, but you will know someone in another country better than if a family member moves away, you can continue a relationship with them in a way that no one ever in history ever could before now. And so there's a sense where, has our community diminished or has our community just changed? There's a sense where our relationships have stretched. We've jumped over our neighbours in one sense. And yet we still need to feel this call to be a people of community, to be a people of welcoming. God doesn't call us to himself alone. He calls us to his church, to be part of his community, to be the people of God. And so there's a call there for us to redeem community, that this is part of the blessing of the gospel, that we should be a people of community. And we should take that seriously as we think about what that looks like. Now, that can be hard for us to apply what that looks like in our lives. There is a reality where the way we operate in our homes has changed, and I think we should consider trying to work hard at opening our homes more than maybe we do. And that's why this year we ran our Meals with Jesus in January, and we deliberately found opportunities and took opportunities to invite people to our houses. But there's other ways we can do community and hospitality outside of that. Even inviting someone to go out for dinner with them, inviting someone to meet at a cafe and spend some time. There are other ways we can do that. The challenge here is to do it beyond just our nearest friends and our most dear loved ones. The challenge here, the message of these strangers that came to Abraham, the challenge is to think about how we reach other people. A God who came near to us calls us to draw near to others. And so that's a challenge that we should feel and we think about as his followers. The Lord comes to us and he overcomes for us. He overcomes the impossible for us. First of all, particularly thinking about salvation. That's a big part of what this story is about. This is the reaffirming of the promise that has already been given to Abraham. This is a huge theme through the last 4 chapters of the Bible. Back in chapter 12, where we started this series, God gives Abraham some promises. You'll be a great nation. All the world will be blessed through you. Those are the picture we get. Almost every chapter after that, it's repeated. So in chapter 13, Abraham's told your descendants will be like the dust. There'll be so many of them. In chapter 15, told your descendants will be like the stars. There'll be so many of them. In chapter 16, the end of chapter 15, Abraham says, well, I don't have a child, so what about my servant being my heir? God says, no, it'll be your own son. So chapter 16, Sarah tries to solve that problem. They have no kids, so she says, what about my servant? You can marry her and have a son with her. And so Hagar has Ishmael to Abraham. But there seems like that's still not fulfilling this promise. And so chapter 17, God says it again, you're going to have countless descendants. And that brings us to where we are. Chapter 18. When this promise happens in chapter 18, this is not the first time Abraham and Sarah are hearing this. This is not the first time God has shown up to tell him this. Because God has a plan of salvation, a plan where all nations will be blessed through Abraham. And it's going to be through Abraham and Sarah. And so God performs the impossible for that plan of salvation. We're told that Abraham and Sarah are both beyond the years of having children, and so God is going to work an incredible miracle in this moment. Let me just talk about that miracle for a moment. I've said this fairly recently, something as a church of young families, a major pastoral issue we face in our church is beginning a family. So things like miscarriage, fertility, not getting married or getting married late in life and not having those opportunities. That's a major kind of thing that happens amongst our church. And I think one of the hard things about that is often it's quite a private suffering that many of you have faced and are facing yourselves. It's almost impossible to avoid that topic in Genesis. Almost each of the patriarchs have a similar story to this. But I do want to be careful as we speak about it. One thing I want to say is the promise to Sarah is not a promise to all women. The promise to Sarah to have a child is not a promise that every woman will have a child. That is a reality that we face in this world. And I think we just, as painful as it is to process that, we need to be careful that we don't over-realise promises that are given in the Bible and apply them unhelpfully to ourselves. The second thing I'd say is Sarah doesn't receive this promise anyway because of her righteousness. This isn't something that's come to her because she is an extra righteous person and God has said, well, you deserve this above all else. In fact, we know she's not. We know that when they go into Egypt, she lies on Abraham's behalf about being married to him. She says she's his sister and she's taken as one of Pharaoh's wives. She does the same thing with Abimelech 2 chapters later. She says, once again, I'm his sister, and gets taken as a wife by Abimelech. Abraham seems to have to explain himself a few times why his sister has been taken as wife from someone else. Just a couple of chapters before, she proposes to Abraham that he lies with the servant girl to have a baby. Sarah is in no way innocent in all this. God hasn't picked her because of some righteousness. And it's really important when we think about why God isn't answering our prayers that we don't. There is a space in the Bible for God acting in a certain way out of discipline, but we want to be careful that God always acts kindly even to the unrighteous. In stories like this, we see that. It's not because she's righteous. And the third thing is, it's not because she has overwhelming faith. In fact, she doesn't. This very story says it plain and simple. She laughs when God gives her that promise. This is not because she has so much faith that God will do the impossible in her midst. And I think it's really important for us to process that, because I think it can be really unhelpful when we over-realise promises of the Bible and apply them to our own lives in an unhelpful way. I have a family friend who, him and his wife were not able to have a child. They were getting later in life and realised that their opportunities were running out. And a pastor prayed over them and said he had a prophecy that they would have a child in 9 months. In 9 months, they fell pregnant, which wasn't quite what anyone thought the prophecy was. But nonetheless, that was the situation that had happened, and they were like, maybe that's what was meant. We'll have a baby in 9 months, and they took that. Sadly, they lost the child. They had a miscarriage, and you can imagine the layers of complexity, grief, and hope smashed in a moment like that. It was so crippling for them that the husband had a mental breakdown. Now, maybe it wasn't related to that, but shortly after that, he had such a severe mental breakdown, it destroyed their marriage. He never worked. This was 20 years ago. As far as I know, he never worked again after that. And I just want to say, over-realising promises that are not promised to us, if we're doing that, we are playing with fire. We want to take the hope that comes in the Bible and we want to apply it correctly. Now, what that means is we hold two things in tension when we think about our prayers. One of them is God is the God who can do anything. He can do anything, and he does do the miraculous. I'm convinced that God does answer prayers. Sometimes he answers prayers through the created world that he has set in motion, the mathematical, scientific world that we live in. And God has set things in motion that at times his plans just seemed like they were always there in motion, and they happened. And he uses science and maths, and that's how we see prayers answered at times. But I also want to say that the Bible is clear that sometimes God seems to intervene, that there's moments where he seems to miraculously break the laws of nature. He intervenes and miraculously does something that's impossible. And that's what we see in this story. I think both those things happen on this side, and so God does answer prayers. But on this side, we also have that he doesn't promise to answer all our prayers. He does promise that he's working for the good of those who are called to him and who love him. But our good is not always our want. What we desire is not always our greatest good. In fact, our greatest good is eternity with him beyond anything else. And so God works in us. And we hold those two things in tension. And I think that's quite a difficult tension to hold. We want to be careful that we don't over-realise the promises of God. But we should still put hope that he does love us and is kind to us and answers prayers. And we should still be asking him, pleading him, with him to answer those prayers. God does do the impossible, and most specifically in this story, he does the impossible for us for our salvation. That is the key point of what's happening here. That he has a plan of salvation through Abraham and Sarah that requires the impossible to happen. That at their old age they might have a child. That's not the only time we see that. We see that through Isaac. We see that through the life of the legacy of Abraham. But maybe most significantly, we see that in Jesus, don't we? That God does the impossible to bring about his plan of salvation. The God of the universe becomes a human, born in an impossible situation of a virgin, that he lives a life and shows a way to God, but then makes a way to God by dying on the cross, and then once again does the impossible and defeats death. That is the message of the God who comes to us and does the impossible for us. That is the impossible we see in this story. The impossible that leads us to salvation. And the impossible that defeats our unbelief. There's an incredible kindness that happens in this story to Sarah. The first kindness is she's brought into the story. It's quite easy for us to be critical when we look at the Bible and the way, for example, God speaks mostly to the men in the Bible. And, we call Abraham the patriarch of faith. This quite literally is the patriarchy happening right here. And it's easy for us to be critical of that. And it's helpful for us to put some of that in the context of history and the world. And what is surprising is the Bible is consistently countercultural in that space. Consistently, God brings women into spaces and into prominence in the Bible in a way that other cultures around the world throughout history have never done. God is bringing women into the spotlight, and we get Sarah is brought into the spotlight here in quite a strange way. She's in the room next door. Now it's a tent. I can't imagine the wall is super thick. She's in the room next door. I don't know. If you read through that dialogue that happens there's a weird kind of back and forth between her and the Lord. Is she still in the room next door? Is she answering? So we're told she laughs silently, and he obviously knows that she did that. So he talks to Abraham. Why did Sarah laugh? She talks to herself. I didn't laugh. And then he says to her, you did laugh. Is he still looking at Abraham? She's in the next room and he's having a dialogue with her in that moment. I can't quite process what's happening there. But she is brought into the story and her unbelief is challenged. And I want to say that's an incredible kindness. God doesn't leave her in her unbelief. He actually challenges her unbelief. And God is in the business of challenging unbelief. God breaks us from our unbelief. And that in itself is an impossible miracle. It's like the picture of a heart of stone being carved by a master carver. That hard process of chiseling off the outer layers is difficult but necessary if the sculpture inside is ever to be revealed. And that's what God is doing here. Rather than just leaving her in her unbelief, he challenges her unbelief and he starts to chip away that hard heart. And it's a reminder to us that God is in the business of breaking down our unbelief. And it's a miracle for us to come to faith in him. And it's a reminder to us that God still works that miracle in hearts all the time. And it's a reminder to us that no one is too far from God. He's in the business of breaking down hard hearts. In this story, he doesn't let her unbelief go unchecked, but he addresses it. And he still does that today. There's a missionary, Henry Martin. He was a missionary in the late 1700s, went to India and Persia, and he wrote diaries, and we kind of can get an insight to his journey, and quite opposition he received in doing ministry in countries that were heavily in other religions that were against him. Some of his powerful testimonies actually happened on the journeys he made on the boat. One of them was his journey to India. He was on a boat with rough sailors, and he proposed the idea that they hold church on the boat every week. You can imagine that sailors were not quite used to that. But in particular, there was one sailor. He just calls him B, just the letter B. He doesn't name him in his diaries, but B is very oppositional to the services that are happening. In fact, he talks about one day in particular, he heard from others that B was going around the boat swearing quite a bit that the church service that day went overtime, something you probably, relate with. And so he's swearing about it, and this is what Henry Martin says, a man who just has a heart for God melting hearts of stone. He says, I scarcely have seen one more determinedly set against holiness. Yet even this man, he may be the first heart to melt when God puts forth his hand. His attitude is there is no heart too hard that God can't melt. In another trip later on in his life, the whole ship, he finds quite a lot of opposition. And he celebrates the power that God might work in their hearts. He says, how stupendous that power, which can make these people followers of the Lamb when they so nearly resemble Satan in pride and wickedness. Here's a man who puts incredible hope in the God who will melt hard hearts. And that is not to say that all hearts are melted and that some won't set their heart against him. But God is in the business of overcoming unbelief. It's a celebration for anyone who is united in Christ that he has done that in you. And it's our prayer that he might do that in others that we love in our lives. And so we want to be praying. We want to be praying for our friends and family. We want to be praying for our children. It's easy for us to say, I became a Christian because I grew up in a Christian home, if that's your story. That's certainly my story. It's easy to kind of fall back on that. And yet there's many who grew up in Christian homes and didn't choose to follow Jesus. It is still a miracle in every heart that comes to be a follower of Jesus, no matter what opportunities you grew up with. And the same thing is true when we think about our kids' ministry and the kids in our lives. It's a great blessing that you might have, that kids might be brought up in a Christian home hearing about Jesus. But breaking hard hearts and bringing people to himself is Jesus' job. It's his business. And we should be praying for him to do that in our children and not be so arrogant that we think we can do that on our own just by sharing Jesus with them. But that a transformation actually needs to happen in them. Let me finish with this story. We've talked about Rosaria Butterfield before. So you may be familiar with her. She was quite strongly against Christianity. She identified as a lesbian. She was a leading voice in feminism and in queer theory. And she was writing articles on those things. One day she wrote a heated article in a newspaper, particularly criticising Christianity for its approach and view of sexuality. She wrote that article. You can imagine she got all kinds of mail for that article she wrote. She got fan mail, people saying, yeah, preach it, tell us more. And she got people that were violently against her. But one letter stood out above all the rest for her. It was a letter from a guy, Ken Smith. He was a pastor. And what stood out to her was that he wasn't angry with her. He wasn't even defensive of her. He wrote her a gentle letter inviting her to reconsider her position. In fact, he invited her to come and have dinner with him and his wife, was his invite. This is what she later writes. She says, "It was the kindest letter of opposition I had ever received." And she took him up on it. She said, "I'll go. It'll be good for my research. It'll be good for the work I'm doing. I will go and hear him out." And she found them to be so kind, she started to meet up with them more often. And she had a miraculous transformation in her approach to Christianity. And she has now become an incredible spokesperson on Christian sexuality, incredible spokesperson on the gospel and how to welcome people to Jesus. And famously, her book is called The Gospel Comes with a House Key, which is to say we need to redeem hospitality in a way that shares Jesus' love in a genuine way. This is the picture of a God who comes to us, a God who draws near and calls us to draw near to others. It's the God who does the impossible to draw near to us and does the impossible so that we can draw near to him, to offer a way of salvation. He does the impossible for us in making a way to salvation and to us in breaking our unbelief and bringing us to him. As we think about today, we got a second week of Alpha, and we're just reminded that all these stories that we hear of God doing this miracle in hearts, we keep praying for that, keep inviting people along. There's other opportunities just outside of Alpha. We try to make church on Sunday a welcoming place every Sunday. We try to apply some of those principles of hospitality as best we can as a community. Our food services team do an amazing job of, we're not killing the calf, bringing it in. We'll leave that one for Abraham, but amazing food to try to welcome people and care for them. This is an invitation of who we are and who we should be in being a people who are transformed by the God who comes near.